When people think of the deadliest wars in American history, their minds often jump to the global conflicts of the 20th century. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Yet none of those wars claimed more American lives than the Civil War. It remains, by a wide margin, the bloodiest conflict the United States has ever endured. But here is something many people do not realize. Despite the staggering scale of death, destruction, and suffering between 1861 and 1865, only a handful of individuals were ever formally tried and executed for war crimes committed during the conflict. One of them was a man named Champ Ferguson. To understand how he ended up on that very short list, we need to begin in the fall of 1864, 3 years into a war that had already torn the nation apart, Saltville, a town worth fighting for. By October 1864, the Confederacy was running short on nearly everything: food, weapons, ammunition, transportation, manpower. Every remaining strategic resource mattered desperately. One of the most vital resources of all was salt. Salt was not just seasoning, it was preservation. Without it, meat spoiled quickly. Armies could not store food. Supply chains collapsed. Soldiers went hungry. And one of the Confederacy's most productive salt operations was located in Saltville, Virginia. The Union understood this. Destroy the salt works, and you weaken the Southern war effort significantly. So in early October 1864, Union forces advanced towards Saltville with a clear objective: damage or destroy the facilities and cripple Confederate supply lines. The Confederates were ready. What followed was a vicious, chaotic battle fought in miserable terrain. Mud, hills, smoke, and confusion. Casualties mounted on both sides. By the end of the engagement, the Union assault had failed. The Confederates held the town. Union troops withdrew, but not everyone could leave. The wounded left behind. Dozens of Union soldiers were too badly injured to be moved. They were left where they had fallen, on the battlefield, and in makeshift medical stations nearby. Among them were members of the 5th United States Colored Cavalry, one of the newly formed black regiments serving in the Union Army. These men had fought fiercely. Many were now wounded and defenseless. The battle was over, but the killing was not. In the hours after Union forces retreated, armed Confederate irregulars, guerrilla fighters operating loosely outside formal command, began sweeping the field. They hunted wounded men. Soldiers who could not stand were shot where they lay. Others were dragged from hiding places and executed. The violence was deliberate and systematic. The number of murdered wounded eventually climbed into the dozens, and then the violence moved to a hospital. Emory and Henry College, a temporary Union hospital, had been established at Emory and Henry College. Even in the darkest chapters of war, hospitals were generally considered protected spaces. The wounded were not supposed to be targets. But for one man, that rule meant nothing. Samuel Champ Ferguson entered the building armed with a rifle. He moved room to room, scanning faces, identifying targets. To him, injured soldiers were not victims. They were enemies who could no longer defend themselves. One of the wounded men lying helpless in a bed was Lieutenant Elza Smith. Ferguson recognized him immediately. Years earlier, Elza had been his brother-in-law during Ferguson's first marriage. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Ferguson lowered his weapon. The two men spoke briefly, calmly, even cordially. It appeared for an instant that shared history might spare a life. Then Ferguson raised the rifle again. He pulled the trigger. The gun misfired. He tried again. Another misfire. A third attempt failed as well, while Smith begged for his life. On the fourth attempt, the weapon discharged. Elza Smith died in his hospital bed. Ferguson walked out and continued. White soldiers, black soldiers, men crawling away, men pleading. It did not matter if Ferguson encountered them. They were likely to die. Outside, he confronted a wounded young private dragging himself through the dirt. Ferguson demanded to know why he had fought alongside black troops. The terrified boy gave no answer. Ferguson asked him where he wanted the bullet. Silence. He shot him. The massacre ended only when a separate Confederate unit, comprised largely of Cherokee and mountain troops, arrived and intervened. With official command present, Ferguson and his men withdrew. By then, the damage had been done. Who was Champ Ferguson? To understand Ferguson's actions at Saltville, we need to go back decades. Samuel Ferguson was born in 1821 in southern Kentucky, the eldest of 10 children. The region where he grew up was rugged and isolated. Communities were tight-knit. Disputes were often handled privately rather than through formal law. Ferguson absorbed that culture and amplified it. By adulthood, he was physically imposing and known for his temper. He drank heavily. He gambled. He did not shy away from confrontation. If he felt insulted or threatened, he responded directly, and often violently. Although many families in the region were modest farmers who owned no enslaved people, Ferguson managed to acquire land and livestock. He also became a slave owner, setting himself apart economically from much of his community. But wealth was not what defined him. His worldview was starkly binary. People were either allies or enemies. There was no middle ground. The incident of 1858, in August 1858, 3 years before the Civil War began, an argument between Ferguson and members of the Evans family escalated into deadly violence. When it was over, a local constable named James Reed was dead. One of the Evans brothers had been stabbed multiple times and left near death. Ferguson fled. The killing did not result in immediate punishment, but it hung over him. The possibility of legal consequences loomed. Then came the war. Choosing a side, the Kentucky-Tennessee border region did not divide neatly into North and South. Families were split. Counties disagreed. Loyalties were personal and complicated. Clinton County, Kentucky, Ferguson's home, leaned Union. But across the border in Tennessee, Confederate sympathy was stronger. Interestingly, many members of Ferguson's own family supported the Union. One of his brothers even enlisted on the Union side. Ferguson chose the Confederacy. Historians debate whether ideology drove his decision. Many conclude his motivations were more practical and self-serving. If the Confederacy won, his past crimes might disappear in the chaos. If the Union prevailed, prosecution was far more likely. He also had financial incentive. As a slave owner, Confederate victory protected his economic interests. Before the war escalated, Ferguson had briefly aligned himself with Union sympathizers. But once he calculated where his advantage lay, he switched. The Confederacy was, in his view, the safer bet, building his own war. By late 1861, Ferguson relocated his family to Tennessee. There he gathered a small band of followers. They were not a formal military unit. There were no clear rules of engagement, no consistent oversight, no structured chain of command. Ferguson and his men targeted individuals suspected of Union sympathies, sometimes based on little more than rumor. One of his earliest wartime killings occurred in November 1861. He rode to the home of William Frog, a neighbor bedridden with measles. Frog was weak, barely able to stand. Ferguson accused him of visiting a Union recruitment camp. Frog denied it. Ferguson shot him in front of his wife and child. Weeks later, he confronted Reuben Wood, a longtime acquaintance. Wood admitted he had visited a Union camp, but appealed to their shared history. Ferguson acknowledged that Wood had always treated him well. Then he shot him anyway. Wood died the next day. A campaign of terror. Over time, Ferguson's group grew to roughly 20 men. Many victims were not soldiers. They were farmers, neighbors, prisoners, the elderly, the wounded. There were reports, some exaggerated, some likely true, of brutal methods, including the use of a Bowie knife. Even Confederate authorities grew uneasy. At one point, he was arrested for killing a man associated with the Confederate government. He was released, and he returned to violence. By the war's final year, Ferguson's body count was staggering. Official charges would later list 53 murders. Unofficial estimates suggest the number exceeded 100. The end of the war. And Ferguson, in April 1865, the Confederacy collapsed. The fighting was supposed to end. For Ferguson, little changed. He continued operating as before. Union authorities decided he would not be treated as an ordinary soldier. He would not be paroled. He would not be absorbed quietly into civilian life. He would be arrested. In May 1865, Union troops took him into custody without resistance and transported him to Nashville. The trial. The military tribunal charged Ferguson with 53 counts of murder. His defense argued that he had been a commissioned Confederate officer and therefore entitled to combatant immunity. Killings committed during wartime, they argued, could not be prosecuted as ordinary crimes. But witness after witness testified. They described executions of prisoners, killings of the sick, murders of unarmed civilians, acts committed far from active battle. When Ferguson spoke in his own defense, he expressed no remorse. He claimed his victims would have killed him if given the chance. The tribunal deliberated briefly. He was found guilty. The sentence, death by hanging. The execution, on October 20th, 1865, Samuel Champ Ferguson was led to the gallows in Nashville before a large crowd. He remained outwardly calm. His final words were a request for divine mercy. When the trapdoor opened, the execution did not proceed swiftly. It took nearly 20 minutes before he was declared dead. His body was returned to his family and buried in Tennessee. Two legacies. Almost immediately, two versions of Champ Ferguson began to circulate. One was documented in trial transcripts, testimony, and graves. The other was shaped by resentment and myth. In some circles, Ferguson was recast as a defiant Confederate hero. Stories emerged claiming Union soldiers had murdered his child or brutalized his family. Claims unsupported by evidence. Such narratives were part of a broader post-war effort to reshape memory and cast former Confederates in a more sympathetic light, but the record remains. Before the war, Ferguson had killed. During the war, he killed extensively, often outside the bounds of combat. After the war ended, he kept killing. He was one of only a tiny number of individuals executed for war crimes arising from the Civil War. In a conflict defined by mass death, it took extraordinary brutality to stand out. Champ Ferguson did.